I'm Kay Savetz, and this is ANTIC, the Atari 8-bit podcast. This interview, however, is about events that happened before the Atari released its first computers. This interview is with Dorothy Siegel, a pioneer in computer music. The music she created was on an IMSAI 8800 computer and a clarinet. The first Philadelphia Computer Music Festival was held August 25, 1978, as part of a show called Personal Computing 78, held at the Philadelphia Civic Center. In 1979, Creative Computing published a record album, also titled First Philadelphia Computer Music Festival. The 12-inch 33 RPM record was of music performed at the festival, 18 pieces, including Dorothy's. Dorothy was co-founder of NewTek, along with her husband Michael Abram and business partner Stuart Newfeld, a company that built add-on music boards for two S100 bus computers, the IMSAI 8080 and the Southwest Technical Products Corporation 6800. The Newtech Music Cards cost $59.95 each. NewTek, spelt Newtech, was not the same company as NewTek, Newtek, the company that sold the video toaster in the 1990s. Dorothy performed Johann Wanhol's Rondo from Sonata in B-flat for clarinet and piano. The IMSAI, with 3 NewTek music boards, performed the piano part, and Dorothy played accompaniment on clarinet. I'm going to play the song now. It's about 4 minutes long. Regarding Dorothy's song, the album liner notes read, "Newtech Music Card for the S100 bus is essentially a digital-to-analog converter controlled by an output port on the computer. The analog output is fed into amplifiers to be heard. This approach to computer music synthesis is extremely flexible since, hypothetically, any possible sound can be created. In actual practice, the performance of the music circuitry is somewhat limited by the speed of the host computer. Each card can produce up to 3 voices output to one channel." Newtek's music software consists of a basic program which converts music into binary tables and a machine language interpreter to play the music with 3 voices and different envelopes. The piece on this record uses 3 cards each playing 1 voice. Check the show notes for an extensive list of links to people that we talk about and the articles that Dorothy wrote for ROM Magazine and Popular Electronics. You can hear the entire first Philadelphia Computer Music Festival album at vintagecomputermusic.com or buy the album on a remastered CD directly from Dave All of Creative Computing Magazine. This interview took place on January 7th, 2014, while I was doing research for a book about the first personal computer magazines. Although I decided not to write the book, I am publishing the interviews that I did while doing the research.
I'm writing a book about the first computer magazines. At this point, it's looking like I'm going to be doing creative computing, byte, and kilobaud microcomputing, which
I used to have the first, 25 or 30 editions of those, but I threw them out after my husband died. No kidding.
Really?
Yeah, threw out a lot of stuff. I have the very first Popular Electronics ad for a home kit.
Excellent.
That's in 75. I found that with the other Popular Electronics article. It is Popular Electronics, January 75. The front cover says, "Project Breakthrough, world's first mini computer kit to rival commercial models. Quote, Altair 8800, unquote. Save over $1,000. So, look at this.
Excellent. That's a milestone.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Why do you think my husband wanted to buy a kit? Because he was an electronics engineer and an audio engineer. And this was, he had a degree in electrical engineering with a concentration on computers as opposed to power, as in power plants. And it was an unusual concentration, but somebody like him would be very interested in having a computer at home. Other people.
Did he see that article
Yes.
and then run out and buy the Altair because of it?
Well, he didn't buy the Altair. He first had to convince me that there was a reason to buy a computer kit. So he and a friend of ours who had a similar background to his, which is basically love of music and a lifelong subscriber to Popular Electronics, and somebody who, built ham radios and things like that, and then got an electrical engineering degree with a concentration in computer science. The two of them ganged up on me and convinced me that I wanted a computer kit. So
how did they do that? How did they sell it to you?
They wore me down, basically. I mean, I thought it was pretty amazing. I lived with my husband while he was going through engineering school, and so I know all the things that he did and all of the courses that he took and all of that stuff, and I know what a thrill it was, the thought of having a computer in your kitchen. It's hard to go back to that point where there weren't computers in everything and there weren't computers everywhere. but
Sure.
there wasn't a single computer anywhere that wasn't in some air-conditioned room somewhere. And he was trained on mini computers and mainframes, and I took a couple of courses because I graduated college and graduate school in 1970, so this was all happening later. I took courses in programming. I took something called PL1, and when this kit came out, I had to teach myself assembler, and I knew BASIC from somewhere. When he and Stuart, my partner, bought this first kit, it was very exciting. I mean, I knew what they were doing. I knew what a resistor was. I knew what all these things were that people now don't see anymore. And it was an exciting thing. So basically they said, you could make music with this. And I just graduated Yale with a master in clarinet, in performance in clarinet. And one of the pieces at my master's degree recital was called, and it was this big hit because people couldn't believe that there would be some electronic music sounds recorded on a tape and that somebody was playing live a piece that had this other instrument called a tape. And it became a really popular thing. But the thought of me playing with a computer as an accompaniment, while it was very intriguing because I like, sort of new things, it wasn't high on my list, let's put it that way. In the meantime, my husband and this guy Stu and I, with a number of other people in New York, some of whom I am still in contact with, started what we called the New York Electronic Music Society, which was a fancy name for, a half dozen or a dozen people who got together who were interested in the concept of making music electronically. So there were things like that going on. I'm sure that ours was just a small little operation, sort of like what happens now, and then accepting that we didn't have the Internet. People still use telephones and other things like that. So what happened was that Stuart and my husband decided...
First of all, let me interrupt. Stuart,
yes.
What was your husband's name?
My husband was Michael Abram, Abram. Not to be confused with the guy who stabbed George Harrison.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
His name is Michael R. Abram, my husband. And my partner was Stuart with a U, Newfeld, N-E-W-F, as in Frank, E-L-D. And the two
when
of them...
you say who was your partner, you mean he was your partner?
He became my business partner.
Your business partner, okay.
Right. He started out as a good friend. But he became my business partner, as I was about to describe to you. The two of them built a computer kit, and the only venue for people to talk about how excited they were about having a computer in their home, not that it could do anything, were like ham radio people. So the first get-togethers of computer enthusiasts, microcomputer enthusiasts, were ham radio festivals, the ham radio operator things, and they became swamped with these people, including the people from Creative Computing, Apple, VisiCalc, other people who went on in that world. And we decided that since there was nothing you could do with a home computer, nothing was built in, we wanted to do an application. The application was play music. That's the story behind the first Philadelphia Computer Music Festival, and last. I think it was the last.
First and last.
Right.
Okay.
So somebody, it might have been the Creative Computing people. It was somebody who was promoting this thing, but I think it grew out of, basically this enthusiastic throng of people out there who they were just sort of electronics type people, the people who read popular electronics, the people who make kits of electronics things, the people who like stereos, all of these electronics, electrical engineering type people, and just people who were, blown away by the idea of having a computer. So what we did was show that you could put the computer to use and we created something we called the Newtech Music Board. Newtech was our company, Newtech Computer Systems, NEWTECH. Mm-hmm. We incorporated and all that, and we did this little printed circuit board. Stuart knew a guy, I forgot his last name, Stan is his first name, who started the first computer store in the back of a hobby shop in New York. And he knew the guy, and he said to Stan, I could make this, or he showed him a prototype, hardwired with, resistors and capacitors sticking out. Mm-hmm. And he said, I could make 100 of these. And Stan said, you make 100, I'll sell 100. And so we sold them through him and through I think it was the first computer show somewhere, and it might have been Philadelphia or Trenton or someplace like that.
Okay, and so when you say Stan, I assume you mean Stan Viet.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, okay.
Dee was his wife's name. Stan and Dee, yeah. So he was the first computer store person, and he challenged us if we made 100, he'd sell them. We sold out 110 minutes at this first computer thing because people were mobbing us because we were the only people who actually had an application. Other people had things like monitors or programs or printers or other things that weren't generally available because there was no industry.
Right.
And we had something that you could actually do, which was make a sound. Actually, the music board did not make music. It was a digital to analog converter with a speaker on it. And you had to load in an assembly language program and then a basic program. And then you had to type in data in order for there to be a sound. And our secret, as revealed in that record, if you have it, was that I was actually a professionally trained musician. I was a professional musician playing along with 3 Newtek computer boards. Other people were electronics people who were programming the computer to make sounds that they thought were music. But I knew what went into musicality and what was important, so I arranged a piece, a Baroque piece by a guy named Johann von Hall. I arranged the piano part for 3 voices, and I played the clarinet part. And I built in expression into the piano part, slowing down, speeding up, trills or whatever. So I built things into the piano arrangement. Into the arrangement of the piano part. And then live, I played the clarinet along with this expressively interpreted piano part. Played on 3 Newtek computer boards. I think it was in one computer, 3 different slots in the same computer. Our limiting factor was the speed of the processor, which was extremely slow in those days. I don't remember now what it was. And the fact there was no storage device. You had to bootstrap the assembly language program by the front switches. The IMSAI had those blue and red switches, remember, in the front?
Yeah.
Okay, so you had to, and I remember it was something like 80 instructions, and I got very adept at flip up, flip down, whatever the pattern was, because we had to do it every single time we turned the computer on. And every time it failed, you had to reboot. And then you would load. It started out with Bill Gates's 5K Basic on tape. Mm-hmm. We had a tape reader, and then it became a cassette tape. And that's how we sold the software for the Newtek computer board was on a cassette tape. Very slow, very crude, but it worked. It loaded the basic program, and then you would create a piece of music that you would save, and then you would play the piece of music, which would be understood by the computer's basic program that was enabled by the assembler program that you bootstrapped off the front panel. So that's why it was pretty amazing. Now, to my husband and Stu, this was nothing because they were computer people. They were audio engineers. Not quite at that time, but shortly thereafter, my husband started working for a company named Electro Harmonics. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
No,
they make musical effects boxes. Like I forgot what they're even called. Not wah-wah pedals, but things.
Stomp boxes.
Yeah, exactly. They were the inventor of that sort of thing. And good friends of ours were the Moogs, as in Bob Moog and his wife Shirley. So we were in that world. And to be able to actually do something on a computer that, had a sound like music. So my husband and Stuart were very knowledgeable about the technical aspects of creating a sound. And I was knowledgeable about the technical aspects of making that sound musical. And then if I played the clarinet along with it, my clarinet playing, if I might say so, was excellent. I was well trained, and I think I played very well. So what you're hearing there is the sound of somebody who knows how to play the clarinet, along with let's say a transcription of the piano part on 3 NewTek computer boards in an IMSAI 8080 computer.
So how many people were at the event, do you think? I mean, was it, we're talking 20
I don't know,
or?
A few hundred.
Yeah.
Yeah, people were wandering in and out. I was almost 6 months pregnant. I was sick. It was late at night. I was not happy. So I was more or less, just sort of wishing I wasn't there.
Right.
And, but, when the time came, and I think we were one of the last people had filtered away because there were only so many renditions of Daisy, Daisy, that you wanted to hear. And then people came back, and there was a lot of people who came because they heard music. They heard a professional clarinet, and it, I think, fooled them, I don't know if that's the right word, into thinking, wow, this computer really makes nice music. So that was the origins. I frankly didn't hear anything else that night that interested me, either from the, let's say, technical end, which I didn't know that much about, but certainly the electronic music end, which I knew a lot about, or from the professional musician end, which I know even more about. So there wasn't much that I thought that was musical. There were things that were interesting, and I'm glad that people were doing them. But I didn't hear anything, and then on the record I didn't hear anything either that impressed me. So I basically thought the thing was a bust, because if I'm not learning something, why did I go? They said they were making a record, but I didn't, lots of people say things. I didn't really believe it.
Right.
But they did.
Yes, they did. So how do you feel that your piece was received?
It was received very well by the people who stuck around that late. What happened was a couple of years later, there was a program on WBAI in New York, which is the Pacifica station, called Personal Computing, by somebody that I knew who was part of this local personal computing group of people in New York. So he had this program called Personal Computing, and his theme music was my piece. I think I appeared on there, on his show a couple of times, but I told him, I said, I'm not about personal computing. I'm about playing the clarinet. I'm about doing other, things with computers, but I'm not about the computing part of it, that you need engineering type people for that. So I demurred, and about 7 or 8, maybe 9, 10 years later, my husband and I and our 2 small children were driving back from somebody's house in New Jersey, and he flipped on BAI, and we heard me, and we were very shocked. So, and then we heard the guy say, this was a piece that was played by somebody named Dorothy Siegel 10 years ago at the first Philadelphia Computer Music Festival, and we tried to get in touch with her, but we can't. So-and-so, one of our listeners, has transcribed it and reproduced it. And I said, wow, it's like I'm not listed in the phone book. I was listed in the phone book. Lots of people knew who I was. I didn't happen to be known to that particular person. So they had a call in. I called in and I said, it's terrible. I said, I like my version better. And then they put it back to my version because it was, like, how could you, why is that interesting? Try to reproduce something. It's like an asymptote. You never get to the point where it's as good as, no less better than. So that was my one experience with that piece. So that piece appeared as their music for as long as they were on, which was, I don't know, a decade or so. And that was the only repercussions. And now there's my son, who refers to himself as a second-generation chiptunes musician.
Right. Now I was going to ask you about that.
Let me just also say that through my husband, we got to know a lot of people. This is at the same time, the late 70s, early 80s, who were designers of electronic music things, not just the Moogs or Bob Moog, and not just Dave Matthews. Ooh, that sounds like a band. The guy who owned Electro Harmonics, but the actual electronic designers really all over the place through those connections. And so my children grew up with these prototype electronic music instruments that eventually became popular things. But we got the prototypes because they used my kids as guinea pigs for little devices, little keyboards, little whatever. So we were very, very active in those days in, thinking about what electronic music things were interesting and moving it along. But that was a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that access to those devices might be what spurred him to become a chiptune musician?
Either today? That or being the child of Dorothy Siegel and Michael Abram. Both of us have very, very, very heavy music interests and backgrounds. And Sam is a natural musician. I mean, he's really gets it. And in terms of electronics, I don't think he's as interested in electronics as my husband was, but musical electronics, yeah, definitely. So he's doing a lot of the things that my husband was interested in, although Sam didn't know about it, until after he died. So it's kind of ironic.
So you said you're not a computer person, or you said you weren't a computer person.
I'm not an engineer.
Not an engineer.
Yeah.
Okay.
In those days, people who knew about computers were people who had advanced degrees in computer science and or electrical engineering, so they came at it from the hardware end, which is what my husband and partner did. They were electrical engineers who studied computers and then became knowledgeable about programming and things like that as to how to use the physical hardware devices. There was a strong divide between hardware and software. And then there were people who were software engineers or systems engineers, and that was another rarefied thing that you got to through mostly a math major in college. It was not something that everybody did all the time at all. Nobody knew how to program. So me taking a programming course, in the early 70s, was highly unusual, because why would you want to do that?
Right. But you knew enough to write 3 articles for
I'm very good at teaching myself what I need to know. I taught myself assembler, which, you get a book and you go through it. And it's not an easy thing to do, but my husband was an electrical engineer. So when I got stuck, he helped me. And then when they wrote the assembler program, I understood it well enough so that when somebody asked me about it, I could explain why and what it was and why they had to do it. BASIC is a very easy language to explain and to program in, as long as what you're doing is very simple. And what we were doing was really very simple. It was a very simple process that took, you had a D to A converter, a digital to analog converter, as a thing that we soldered onto this printed circuit board. And that, once a signal went into this board as a piece of data, it came out the other end as a pitch. And you controlled it by stepping it through a table that would determine the frequency was determined by, how fast the wave was going. But you stepped it through a table that made it a square wave, a triangle wave, or I forgot what the third one was. So it was a very simple thing conceptually, so that anybody who had a basic understanding of basic programming could understand the program. Because sometimes, given that these were home computers, they had to type in the basic program. And we gave them that. So it was not a very sophisticated thing. We found that a lot of the people who bought our computer were people at places like Bell Labs, because they said, much cheaper to buy your thing than to make it from scratch ourselves.
Sure.
So they bought like a half a dozen.
Do you know what the cost of your gadget was?
Yeah, it was $60.
60? 60?
59.95, and it was we made one model for the S100 bus and one for the Southwest 6800.
And who actually designed the hardware?
Stuart.
Stuart.
Well, Stuart and my husband. Yeah, but it was it was the two of them together actually. And then we had to do things because there was absolutely nothing. For example, they had to design a driver for the monitor. There was no such thing as a driver for the monitor because there were no monitors.
Right.
No such thing as a driver for a printer. We used a teletype machine. So all of these things, you needed to be a computer engineer, a hardware kind of person who had some software knowledge. So my husband and Stuart developed whatever software knowledge they needed in order to, say, write a driver. And then when databases started coming out, we were one of the early buyers of DBase. We had something like serial number 600. So we bought that, and I said, I know a lot of people who would love to have the ability to have a mailing list computerized, small organizations or stores or something. I could probably make a business out of doing that kind of thing. So my husband wrote a program, believe it or not, that created a name and address program that allowed you to have or not have a second address line. How simple is that? Well, It wasn't being done, and it was actually, it became a chapter in a book on DBase programming, if you can believe it. That was the state of the art. I mean, you either had a big computer, a mini computer, or a mainframe, which had, multiple levels of God knows what, and to the extent that you knew how to program it, you were doing something in some old language like Fortran or COBOL, or you were doing a front-end thing that you really didn't know programming, you just put things in. They were very happy to have this opportunity to connect the guts of the computer to doing something, in this case, connecting to a monitor or outputting music. I was on television a few times. Vanessa Redgrave and Frank Field had a show called Not for Women Only on Channel 4 on NBC New York. And, we went to this show, and it was really hair-raising because it was a home computer. It didn't always turn on. It failed. And I was just so freaked out. So my husband took off from work, which wasn't easy for him, and he went with me, and he set the damn thing up, and I couldn't get it going, and he was one of those people who was very cool under very, very, very stressful technical situations. He could always save the day, and right as they pointed to me to start talking, he got the damn thing working. So I was able to play live on this recording to play this little duet. I think I played a Bach two-part invention, but only because he was able to get the damn thing working at the last minute. And that,
what was this television show?
It was called Not for Women Only, and it was NBC in New York, but it was apparently broadcast everywhere because my brother was on some business trip in, I think, D.C., and he said he was shaving in the morning, and he saw me. So a lot of people everywhere saw me. I guess the show was seen elsewhere, and I guess it was repeated a lot of times. So the reason why was because Frank Field asked the question, what can you do with one of these home computers? I mean, why would somebody want a computer in their home?
Right.
I said, that's a good question. And the answer is there aren't actually that many things you can do with it. But and he said, things like converting recipes. And I said, I can't imagine somebody who's interested in having a home computer being interested in converting a recipe, like cut down from 10 people to 3. I said, I have never heard of anybody being interested in that. However, and another thing that people used to do was say you could balance your checkbook. I said,
right.
And so I took the checkbook and I put it on top of the computer, and I said, see, it's balanced. I said, this makes no sense. It has no practical value. I said, making music, now that's another thought. So that was, our claim to fame.
Was that before or after the music festival, do you know?
I think it was shortly before.
So
wait a minute. Wait a minute. I'm remembering something. I was in the car, pregnant with Stuart, and we got rear-ended by a bus. And Stuart actually suffered an injury. I wasn't really concerned about the baby, but I was concerned about the computer in the trunk that had been rear-ended by the bus. And I'm trying to remember. That was in New York on 6th Avenue. I'm trying to remember. So that must have been about the same time or shortly thereafter. I think that was going to a computer show. We went to a lot of computer shows at that point. So we showed it all over the place. There were all these shows on weekends that people would flock to by the thousands. And we were a hit, and we sold a lot of these boards. Mm-hmm. Mostly.
Do you know how many you sold? I mean, a total?
I would say somewhere between I'd say about 3,000, 2,000, 4,000, somewhere in that range. Yeah. And most of them were made by my 14-year-old brother-in-law on my kitchen table, which I called the world headquarters of NewTek Computer Systems. And my brother-in-law was thrilled because he got minimum wage, and he was 14.
Mm-hmm.
And if he wasn't around to make them, I did it. What?
It's a big deal when you're 14.
Yes, it was a big deal. And he wasn't living at home, which was another big deal. He was living in the city.
Okay. Did you advertise in Creative Computing or any of the computer magazines? Or?
Yes, but mostly we looked for free advertising, which was people writing about it. And then to the extent that we did any advertising, it was little things, those little, like 1 inch high, one column height, 1 inch column.
In the back of the magazine.
Wherever they wanted to put it, we were happy to have it.
Right.
And we always got response. Neither Stu nor I are very, this sounds terrible, interested in making money. I mean, the Apple people, for example, were obviously interested in making money, and so were a lot of other people. Stuart was interested in how cool it was and all the other great things he could think of to do. And I didn't mind making money, but I had other things to do. We had just bought a house, which was a dump, and I was renovating it. And as I said, I was pregnant, so I started having children, and I had to make money somehow in order to contribute to the, the family income. So I had to be pretty serious about other things. So this wasn't top of my priority list to set out on a business and make a name for myself. I never really cared that much. So we knew that this was going to be something that we would take only so far, and then there would be the technological change that was occurring was like daily. You could see it in front of your eyes. And unless you were devoted to, being very much on top of all of these developments, you were going to be passed up. So we sort of knew that from the beginning, and we were happy with that because Stuart and my husband were having great fun. This was what they always wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And I was making enough money to justify my time.
Right.
I spent 10 hours, 15 hours a week at it and made about that amount of money. So it was satisfying. And then when my daughter was born, I turned to things that I could do at home that didn't involve me going out, which was a lot of writing articles and ad copy for people who are getting into this computer business.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a couple of computer companies or people who were around in those days, and they didn't usually last more than a couple of years at most, that, for example, they asked me, who wrote your manual? I said, I wrote my manual. And they said, would you write a manual for me? I said, sure. So I got into writing, and I'm good at that because I was married to an engineer and a partner of an engineer. So I would get them to explain things to me, and by the time I got it out of them, I could explain it in very straightforward language.
Right.
So I had that skill, and I'm a decent writer. I wouldn't say I'm very good at it, but I'm literate and organized. So I was able to present information to a user that helped them do something, the thing that we wanted them to do. So I got into that business of writing technical manuals, mostly because I could do it on my own time in my own way. And that was the main thing that I made a living out of for a number of years.
Awesome. And what do you do today?
You're not going to believe it.
Okay. I'm sitting down.
Oh, well, the people that I work with now, I just told them that I had to get home because I had a call with somebody about my life in computer music. Mm-hmm. They said, what? I mean, this was before they were born, my colleagues.
Right.
So they have no idea that there's anything before when there was computers and everything, and computers everything. I am a policy analyst in education. I've done at NYU. I've done research and evaluations and studies, and I'm also an activist in school reform, special education reform, and I've been doing this for about 20 years. I'm basically an activist and a political activist by avocation. Mm-hmm. Including and especially the people who just got elected up and down the city government in New York City now. I've been trying to help this come about for about 35 years. I'm not kidding you. So combining the two of them, about 10 years ago, I helped create a program for children with autism that's a total inclusion program in very ordinary public schools in New York City. Mm-hmm. And there are now about 750 kids in this program in New York City Department of Ed in 31 schools across the city. So today was a meeting of about 25 people who are involved in the program in the Department of Ed and at NYU, and it's a very robust thing that a lot of people are very happy with, especially the parents of these children. So awesome. That's what I'm involved with now, and I think some of the traits that I was describing to you have helped me with this, which is I really don't care what anybody thinks of me, and I don't care. Yeah, and I people say to me, "Oh, you think outside of the box," and I go, "Honey, I have been trying to find that box my whole life." So it's not a matter of thinking outside of the box; it's not knowing where the box is to think inside of. So to imagine being able to play music accompanied by a computer is the kind of thing that was out of the box then. And I've been doing things like that since then. I don't say this with pride. I say this is a matter of a statement of fact, that I just see things differently than other people. And then I try to make the opportunity for myself to do the thing that I want to do because I believe it's the right thing to do, whether it's a political thing or an education thing, and I'm particularly passionate about education and everybody getting an opportunity to get what they need from an education system so that they become happy, productive adults, which has nothing to do with what's going on in education now. But New York City just reverted to thinking about education as involving teachers and children learning together as opposed to putting a kid in front of a computer, pressing a button, and hoping that somebody in India can help them. Right. It's disgraceful what's been happening, but New York has just taken a hard turn toward reality. And everybody I know in the education system in New York is now exhaling after 12 years of the man who would convince everyone that he's the smartest guy in the world, especially when it comes to education. And he was an idiot. So I've been actively involved in that whole trying to get the people to understand, get everyone to understand that this is not what education should be, that we have to think differently. And that's, I would say, my main passion. So that's how I come at this stage of my life to this point. And the thing that I find amazing is very similar to that computer music festival. You know, like, this is wacky. You know, why would I want to get up in front of these people and play the clarinet? Well, I was a performer, so I could get up in front of any audience and play clarinet, even if it was nothing I knew anything about, because I was a performer, so you could perform. But why would I want to type in 25,000 keystrokes, which is what it took? Because every note took 7 keystrokes.
For the 3 parts?
Right. I had to program each part, and each part had a bunch of notes, roughly 7,000 notes, and they had to be, you know, so, and every there were 3 parameters, I think, that you could control, maybe 4, I don't remember, but you had to indicate those for each note, surrounded by delimiters. In this case, I think it was quote marks and a comma. So you had to do that for every sound.
So 7 characters. So I'm assuming like pitch, duration, that sort of thing.
Well, duration, I think, was a given. Let's see, pitch was one. A timbre, you know, one of the sounds that we were able to do. Maybe it was duration. It was a third one, but I think you're right. I think it was duration. Yeah, it was how long it was going to be. Yeah, right. You're making me recall things I haven't thought about in many years. It's a wacky thing to even conceive of doing something like that, and but in retrospect, it was not a bad thing, and maybe it advanced the state of the art, maybe not, but it was, you know, different. So I would say that that's the same way that I approach education reform, education for the children that I refer to as the leftovers, the people who don't conform to the way billionaires think children learn, which is most children. And so you have to create a system around the child. And once you start looking at things that way, then you will never be able to think of education in another way. And I think a lot of those kind of, oh, yeah, this makes sense, things happened about the time of that concert. A lot of things happened about that time. I was withdrawing from that world because I had a baby. I actually was sick for a while, so that got me out of the loop, but other people took off. I know that creative computing played a very important role at that time. We were definitely subscribers. I think we talked to him a few times.
To Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the time. I don't now remember any of that. I just remember that it was a beacon of light in the wilderness, his magazine, because it wasn't technical. It crossed the divide, not only the divide of doing something useful, but actually trying to do something creative. What a concept.
Yeah.
So that's why you'll notice that the other performances recorded on that record were not that creative. They didn't know how to be creative musically because they weren't musicians. It was simple.
Right. Don't
give me, a non-artist, a paintbrush and expect something to come out that's worth looking at.
Sure.
So that's why I think our piece sounded good and why a lot of people, liked it and thought it was worthwhile. And that was the reaction we got. And my reaction to that, by the way, was, thank you, but I'd rather be playing with a string quartet, playing a Mozart quintet. Or I really, musically it was not the highlight of my life at all. It was just something interesting, weird, different. Why not?
Right. Once you've done it, and move on to something.
Yeah, move on to something else equally interesting. I mean, I was, when I was in graduate school, I was known as the clarinet player who you could put anything in front of and she'll give it a try. I didn't really if something was playable, even if it wasn't playable, I'll let you know it's not playable. But I was always interested in trying something, because why not?
Right.
And I never got an answer to that question.
Why not?
Yeah.
Right. I want to make sure that NewTek, NEWTECH, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's no relation to the
Nope.
the video company that came later, NewTek.
Nope.
Okay.
No.
I assume not,
We incorporated in New York, and we did a careful search, and they don't give you a name in New York, I guess elsewhere,
right?
Unless there's nobody else with that name in that state.
Okay.
So with Newtech Computer Systems, and we went out of business, I can't tell you how long ago. I basically sold out to my partner in 80, I think, or 81 or something around there, before IBM started making personal computers. I mean, you're talking about way back when.
Right.
And he continued for some time, some short amount of time, a year or two. But all of our interests moved on.
Sure.
I didn't have the luxury of not supporting myself.
Right, I understand. Yeah. With kids and everything.
Yeah, and a house, a very old house that was in very bad shape that I bought for nothing because I would put my labor into fixing it up. Mm-hmm. And it took about 20 years, but it's fixed up. Now,
right, and
now people say, "Oh, you live in Brooklyn? Wow!"
So you live in the same place still?
He actually lives in the same room that he was born in.
Wow.
We never, all sorts of the basic plan that fell through was that my husband died 7 years ago, and so whatever plans that Sam had and I had were changed at that point, and so Sam stayed here. And he's still here. It's a very large apartment in a house. So you're able to, and it's an old house, so it has these very thick walls and stuff. So you're able to be someplace in the house and not know there's somebody else here. And that's really, really nice. We shared a living room with a great music collection and a great music system.
I bet between you two, you do.
Well, it was. Yeah. It was my husband's thing. He evolved a great, I wouldn't say a really, really good music system. And Sam, it says, in honor of my father, I will increase my knowledge of audiophilia, of audio stuff, the kind of things that audio nuts are interested in. Like platinum wires instead of copper wires or stuff like that, which I think is nuts, but my husband used to think it was important, and other things like that, because he was an engineer, and he even if he couldn't hear the difference, he could see it on a oscilloscope or whatever the equivalent is now.
Right.
So he was very interested in the whole transformation of music from not just sounds, but sounds you could see on an oscilloscope that you could translate into sounds that you feed into a computer that then has a video monitor that you can see it. And for the last 10 years or 15 years, you've been able to actually make and edit music at home on your so-called home computer. All of these things are steps that he would have loved to have lived to see. And that Sam is very much tuned into.
Yeah, awesome. I think I have one more question for you. This part of the book is about the Computer Music Festival. You told me there's a couple hundred people there, and they're coming and going.
At the concert, I think the concert was part of a larger computer music event.
Okay.
Like a convention. I don't really remember what it was like because I was focused on the music thing.
Sure. Okay. Well, if you don't remember, that's fine. But I was going to ask you as for the concert, if you could set the stage for me, paint a picture a little more about what it was like.
I don't really remember. I just remember that there were a lot of people doing things with electronics that were or were not working. Because all of us had these very kludgy, very unreliable systems because they were all homemade. It's hard to describe how no industry there was, even in 79. There was nothing standard. There was nothing. Radio Shack had, I think, just come out with their computer, which was referred to as Trash 80 instead of TRS 80. But
right.
It was 3 years before IBM came out, or maybe it was Apple that came out first. One of them. It was a year or two or three before the big
the
people.
Apple one. Right.
I don't even remember the Apple one. I just remember they had an Apple. Maybe it was just called Apple, and then there was Apple II. But there was no standard computer. If you take a look in Dave's magazine, I'm sure you'll see that there were ads for things that you absolutely. I mean, there were some software things actually were pretty amazingly prescient. Like I think it was something 123. I forgot now what it was. That became Excel.
Right.
I remember being really excited about that because my brain is actually an Excel spreadsheet. That here was this program that you could actually enter data into cells. And
right. Are you thinking of VisiCalc or
VisiCalc? Yeah, I think it was. But there was something 123. I forget. I mean, the two of them were the. I remember because we bought one or both those programs, and they were expensive, by the way. You know, there were a few $100 to buy one of these programs. So.
Right.
I remember buying one of these programs and thinking that I had died and gone to heaven because you could do anything with a spreadsheet compared to not having a spreadsheet program. You know, so all these applications became possible, and that's what interested me because I was interested in doing things. I wasn't interested in playing around with code or electronics or, you know, things like that. I learned how to solder. More importantly, I learned how to desolder because I made a lot of mistakes. But to me, what was interesting was, for example, having a spreadsheet that I could actually do something with and then do something useful and then charge somebody for it because it was something, I was always ahead of the curve. I was always doing things that were, that other people couldn't do because I had a computer at home and a husband who could make sure that it worked. And that was his job. These, just one more thing, these computers were so kludgy, and they were so, I mean the systems, they were so non-user-friendly that they were just parts, like this big teletype that we had in our kitchen. It must have been 200 pounds. I mean, it was really, it was a huge thing, and it was a fast teletype. It was a dot matrix that's something like 55 words per minute, which was blazing speed for something that was, a mechanical device. It needed, as I said, it needed a driver, and the thing I remembered though was coming home from that program, Not for Women Only. My husband said, "I have to go to work. I'm leaving you here. Take the cab." So I packed up everything, and I put the stuff in the cab, and they were big, heavy things. The computer itself was heavy because it had a huge, in there, power supply in there, and the monitor, forget about it. I mean, so it was just with these big, heavy things. So unfortunately, I was young and strong. I put them into a cab and then unloaded them into my apartment, my building, and into the elevator, into my apartment, and put them upstairs. And I called up my husband and I said, I forgot the order in which I plug things in. And he said, "I'm really tired of getting these questions from you. You've done it 100 times. Do it yourself." So I did it myself. And what I forgot to plug in was, it's called an isolation transformer that isolated the very high voltage TV from everything else. So I didn't plug that in. And when I plugged the TV into the wall, the refrigerator smoked. And the printer smoked. And it was scary. Unfortunately, the circuit breaker didn't click in fast enough, so I fried everything.
Oh, man.
Parts of the computer, the refrigerator, as I said, just whatever was connected in the wall got zapped. And some of those, and the printer started smoking. It was really horrible. My husband never said that to me again.
Right. You asked for help.
I asked for help, and he said, "You should know better." And I said, "Well, you're right. I should know better." But I didn't get that one part. Did it make a difference if I plugged the monitor into the TV into the isolation transformer and then into the wall, or if I put the isolation transformer after the monitor, which then went into the computer? Well, we know the answer.
Apparently it made a difference.
Right. So it was 2 weeks. My husband spent every evening. I mean, I must say he probably enjoyed it because he liked to troubleshoot and find out what was
Right.
wrong, and then order parts and look up on these schematics, where it could possibly be, and then find it. It was like Where's Waldo, and they were very complicated electronics, so it was very challenging. I gave him something fun to do. So that was the state of things at the time of that music festival.
Mm-hmm.
So
Wow.
looking back on it from this perspective, it's hard to imagine. It was really the dark ages.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he and I used to say, "Oh, wow," every, 6 months. I remember we got a 90K external hard disk drive, which was a CD-ROM? No, I don't remember what it was. It was a disc. It was a magnetic
Mm-hmm.
disc. It was like a cassette, except it was a disc. And I said, 90K. I remember saying this. What could we ever do with 90K? It sounded like so much.
Right, yeah, you could never fill that.
It could never fill that. 90K, not 90 gig, 90K. Wasn't even a megabyte. It was amazing. Most Word files are much larger than that. So I remember the 90K drive, and then it was a megabyte. Holy mackerel. And these things were expensive. They were like $500 because there were very few of them, and some schmo like us was making them in Minnesota or someplace in their garage.
At their kitchen table, by their
kitchen table, exactly. The one standard thing was this S100 bus. That became a standard. That was the Altair 8080 and the IMSAI 8080 using the Intel 8080 processor had an S100 bus, and that bus was just a piece of the computer system that had these little gold things sticking up, and that standardized around that particular configuration. So that was called an S100 bus. That's what it was called. So the article that I wrote for Popular Electronics at the end of '79 was basically trying to sell CP/M as the software analog to the S100 bus. So that the same way the S100 bus, it was a concept. The same way the S100 bus allows you to standardize, doesn't matter which system, and there were systems then, not just Altair and IMSAI, you could plug anything into an S100 bus. But what would be the operating system that you would use? And Microsoft and DOS actually was, I think, the first standard operating system, but the guy who was behind CP/M was trying to make CP/M a standard for software operating systems, and to make it analogous to a bus, so that everybody would write programs in CP/M,
right?
So that they could be plugged in. And again, nobody was doing this. It was even as late as 1980. There was no standard. So, trying to give you the flavor of the day. So people had to pay attention to these really technical things that had nothing to do with computing creatively or anything else, because they didn't exist. The concept of a software bus or hardware bus was new. The concept of not recreating the wheel for each computer was new. On NPR today, there was something about the Mechanical Engineer Society and their being behind the standards behind everything, whether it was a screw thread or an elevator.
Right.
Okay, so that's what this was. And there were people like my husband who were engineers who understood what a standard was. Now, the IEEE set the standards for electrical and electronic things. So a lot of the earliest things that were done in this world were related to those standards. But there were no standards in software because there was no software.
Right.
There was no operating system. There were no applications.
Drivers write everything.
Right. One assumes. Yeah. Now you go to a list of which driver you want to install. The concept didn't exist.
Right.
And that's why when Apple came out with something all-in-one, more or less, keyboard and a monitor, what a brilliant idea. You didn't have to install a driver.
Right.
In 1979, if I said driver to you, you would actually know what that meant.
Sure.
Now you don't have to know what that means because it's plug and play or whatever the equivalent is or was at that time. So that kind of, well, of course it has its downsides, like everything is Microsoft or Apple. The downside to standardizing around something is that it's harder to do things that are not standard in that way. But none of that existed except for, as I was saying, an IEEE standard, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And there were those, but that was having to do with electronics and not having to do with, certainly not software or the particular hardware that became personal computing. Because prior to this, the smallest computer was a mini computer, and nobody touched those things unless they knew what they were doing. One of the things that I did with computers after that was I created a program that my husband and I would take to an auction at our child's school, and then we would run the auction basically using an application in DBase. It started out in DBase that would connect up the item, the person, and the amount, and then we would spit out invoices. And everybody thought it was magic. And what kind of a computer are you using? So right. I used to explain to people it has nothing to do with the computer. It's actually a very simple program. And, I just stopped saying that after a while. I would say to them, this program is something that we wrote, and it's not written to be user-friendly. In fact, if you press the delete button right now, you erase the program. And they sort of understood that that was bad.
Right.
So in the same way, music programs or things that would allow you to play music didn't exist. Nothing existed. It was fun.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dorothy.
You're welcome. Good luck.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.